Good evening. We're ready to get started. We're going to be learning Maseches Succah Daf Chaf Beis, and as well part of Chaf Gimel Amud Aleph. Normally we would learn the whole Amud Aleph on a Thursday, but as you can see, the next Amud is particularly short on Chaf Gimel Amud Beis, and that will make for Shabbos to be a regular length of Gemara. So tonight we'll go a drop shorter. Chaf Beis at the top, Chaf Beis Amud Aleph. Special thank you to Rabbi Tzvi for hosting and to your Rebbetzin for putting all of us together. Thank you very much. We will be having Mariv after this, and the schus of hearing from Rabbi Shmuel Brazil, which is a tremendous kavod. He's at Ari Shabbat's house now, and Ari is going to bring him, I presume, for Mariv, which is supposed to be around.
Like this whole thing is like Ari supposed to come to the
Yeah, he's been ditching, as I understand. Yeah. This is recorded, by the way, Ari. I love you. Okay, let's get started. Daf Chaf Beis Amud Aleph at the top, a brand new Mishnah. The Mishnah writes, Succah hamiduvleles, a word that we don't know and don't yet recognize. We'll learn about this in the Gemara. If you have a sukkah that's miduvleles, and shetzilsa meruba mechamsa, and it has more shade than it has sun, halacha is kshera. So off the cuff, we have to ask ourselves the question of whether or not this is a reference to one sukkah or two different sukkahs. Is miduvleles one type of sukkah and silsa meruba mechamsa a different type of sukkah? Or is it no, this is one sukkah with two features? We'll discuss that in the Gemara. We still don't know what miduvleles is. We'll get there soon. Hame'uve, from the word av, thick. Hame'uve kimin bayis. If a person has schach that is thick, like the schach of, like the roof of a house, even though it's the case that you are not able to see the stars, the halacha is that it is kosher. This is something that we have to look into. We remember from as little kids in school, we like to see the stars, and there's a famous fort that Sarah's extra name in the Torah was Yiska milashon schach, and the godless of Sarah was that she was sechacha, that she was able to cover herself in a way where her beauty would shine through. A beautiful vort and tznius, that's chacha, yiska, Sarah, that she dresses that way. Okay, very good. But anyways, that's what the Mishnah says here, is that it's considered to be totally kosher if you are not able to see the stars. Is there a maximum? What if it is those blackout shades? How far do we go? We'll discuss that in the Gemara a little bit later. So we had opened our Mishnah on Daf Chaf Beis with a sukkah hamiduvleles. What is that? My miduvleles. What is that? So says the Gemara, Machlokas Samarim Amar Rav, sukkah aniya. It is a poor man's sukkah. What does that mean? Says Rashi, line 5, Dibur Hamaschel Aniya, it's a poor sukkah. Sheyesh b'sechacha kanim me'at. There aren't a lot of pieces of wood there. V'yesh ba'avir harbe. There are a lot of spaces that are open to the sky. Ella she'ein ba shlosha b'yachad. But in no place is there 3 tfachim that are totally open. As we know, there's a psul in the sukkah. If a sukkah has 3 tfachim of total open space, that is considered a psul in the sukkah, and that is a big halachic problem. So this sukkah is a sukkah aniyah. It doesn't have a lot of schach, and there are some pockets in it, and we still see that it's kosher. That's sukkah hamiduvleles according to Rav. Line 5, the Shmuel Amar no. Sukkah hamiduvleles is a sukkah that is kana ole v'kana yored, where the wood beams are actually staggered in height. One of them is resting on the sukkah, the other is held up by posts and it's resting a little bit above. So you kind of have like at schach level, a little bit higher, a little bit lower, and they're not all on the same level. Some are of different heights. That's how Shmuel defines miduvleles. And then the Gemara is going to touch on a question that I foreshadowed a little bit, which is as to whether or not miduvleles and the second case of the Mishnah is silsa meruba mechamsa, is this one case or two? Rav, says the Gemara, Rav tani chada, v'shmuel tani tarte. Rav says that our Mishnah is really only talking about one case. And Shmuel says there are different cases. Let's understand Rav. Rav tani chada, how does Rav understand our Mishnah? That miduvleles and silsa meruba mechamsa are only talking about one. It's very simple. Sukkah miduvleles, like the Mishnah says, my miduvleles midul deles, that it's dal from the lashon of pur, that it's very thin. And for as much as it's true that the schach is sparse and not so dense, it's still the case shetzilsa meruba mechamsa, and therefore kshera. So that's how Rav reads our Mishnah, is that we have a case of miduvleles coupled with silsa meruba mechamsa, and therefore the sukkah is still kshera. However, v'shmuel tani tarte, we're 8 lines down, Chaf Beis Amud Aleph, Shmuel says our Mishnah is dealing with 2 different cases. My miduvleles, what is the word miduvleles in our Mishnah? Like we saw, it's midbul beles. The schach is all on different levels, like we said. Vitar take tani, and really there's two cases. One is sukkah mibul beles is kshera. It's a little bit of a different word. He plays on the words here. The language in our Mishnah was miduvleles, and here on the 10th, 11th line, he calls it mibul beles. So sukkah mibul beles kshera, that when the schach is at slightly different levels, and there may be pockets of light that can come in, we'll discuss that soon, that's a kosher sukkah. And as well, unrelated to the first case, vi shetzil samruba michamsa kshera as well. And Amar Abaye is trying to understand the sheet of Shmuel. Shmuel had said that the schach is at different levels, kind of staggered in height. So Amar Abaye, lo shanu ella she'ein ben zela zeh shlosha tvachim. So what we're talking about over here is if you have schach, and if you look at an aerial view from above, it does cover the whole sukkah. But when you look from the side view, you see schach at different heights, and you have like pockets of light that can come in. So Amar Abaye, we need to understand Shmuel. Lo shanu ela she'ein ben zela zeh shlosha tvachim. That when you have schach that's at different heights, as long as they're within 3 tfachim of one another, the higher elements of the schach and the lower elements of the schach are within 3 tfachim, no problem. That, of course, triggers the halacha of lavud, and it's all considered to be flat, like one roof. But if, in fact, the gap between the raised schach and the lower schach is 3 tfachim, if it's 3 or plus, then therefore that would be a sukkah psula. But Rava takes a divergent approach on all of this. Amar Rava, a quarter of the way down, even if there were more than 3 tfachim, the halacha is that it is still kosher. So we should have this instant question: how in the world could this still be kosher? You have schach that's sitting on top of the sukkah, and you have schach that's 5 tfachim above it. It's being held up by a post. However, it's being held up, but it's 5 tfachim above. Why would that work? There's no lavud. So we have to ask the halachic question of what are the mechanics to allow for this to work, to make everything combine and become kosher schach. So Amar Rava, he says, yeah, even if there's 3 tfachim nami, it'll still be kosher. How does that work? Lo amran ela she'ein begago tefach. Where do we say that this actually works? It works if the schach has a width of at least 1 tefach, and this, of course, is part of the halachos of ohel, that we know that an ohel has a minimum halachic requirement of a tefach. If it doesn't have a tefach, it's not an ohel. Aval yesh begago tefach kshera. If in fact it has that amount of width, if it's a tefach kshera, why? De amrinan, we're going to learn a new idea now. De amrinan chavut rami. What is chavut rami? So chavut rami means like this. I have one piece of schach that's going across the length of my sukkah, resting on top of the sukkah. I have another piece of schach that's above 3 tfachim, let's call it 5 tfachim off of my sukkah. So the halacha is that if this piece of schach is at least a tefach wide, chavut rami, halachically, we assume that it drops down and they're perfectly level. Okay? As long as it's a minimum of a tefach, it doesn't matter. Seemingly, there's no maximum, correct?
Well,
there is a maximum of 4 tfachim on the other side. Yeah, that's true, because we learned about that, or 4 amos, depending on what sukkah schach psula is. So on this height, there seems to be it's a total drop down. That even though in Metzias, like if you take pictures from the side, it's going to look like this. But halachically, we treat them as shavet b'shavet, that they're totally schach.
Why is it 4 tefachim limit? You just said you could have.
No, because schach psula is.
It's not psula because if it's an amma that's.
Schach psula is either machlokas. We saw this, right? It's either 4 tfachim or 4 amos. But either way, let's assume 4 amos. It's usually what we assume, anyways. Four tfachim.
It's 1 tefach plank, so the whole sukkah could be 1 tefach plank.
It could be if you have sequential 1 tefach planks. That's a kosher sukkah. But what Hirsch is saying is that you can't take a 10-foot piece of plywood, 10 feet by 10 feet, and drop it down in the sukkah. That won't work. Any one board has a maximum width of 4 tfachim.
But if you have this big height,
yeah,
you wind up with the problem.
The Gemara is going to ask your question, exactly that question. That's right. So the Gemara says, Chavud Rami, that according to Rava, the reason why we don't need to be concerned about a gap of more than 3, what happened to Lavud? We don't need Lavud because Chavud Rami. As long as this is 1 tefach wide, it can drop down, and halachically at least, it's the mechanism that makes this work is Chavud Rami. So that's what the Gemara says. And Amar Rava, Mino Aminallah. From where am I telling you this idea? That when one piece does have a tefach, that's when we say chavud rami. Lo amrinan chavud rami. But where we don't have the upper piece of wood with 1 tefach wide, we don't say chavud rami. Let's ask the question more simply. How do we know that chavud rami works with a board that's 1 tefach wide? So it says the Gemara ditznan. And here we're going to get into a little bit of construction. So if you ever do construction, they're first going to build out the wood frame, and then they're going to start doing the other stuff, right? So let's say they're building 2 floors of wood frames, and the rafters of floor number 1 are aligned with the rafters of floor number 2, each of which are tefach wide. But that's not how our homes are built. Usually the 2x4s are standing, I think, when they do that.
Yeah.
They're standing up the other way. Tefach
Tefach
is 4 inches. Yeah, it could be for the wide. Could be, right? In my house, they didn't build the house as nicely as that. That's the ones in our house that went across. They were regular 2x4s or 2x8, whatever they were, but they were standing on their side. Let's assume that they were at tefach wide. That's the presumption of this Mishnah. We're just about halfway down Chaf Beis Amud Aleph. Ditnan. The Mishnah writes, Koros habayis, the beams of a house, v'ha'aliyah, and the floor that's above it, she'ein alehem ma'aziva. They have yet to have the drywall put on, or back in the day, whatever the lime that they were using. Lime? I think it was plaster. The plaster, asbestos? Yeah. Let's just start with the cancerous stuff. Straight to the carcinogens. Yeah. So ve'shein alehem ma'aziva, they're not finished yet. It's just open. It's the open wood frame. Ve'hein mechuvanos. This is a very important word. The rafters on the bottom floor are mechuvan to the rafters on the top floor. And what we're going to be looking at is how does tuma move around in this house where there's no ceiling yet other than the rafters, 1 tefach each. 1 tefach is enough for ohel. So if there's a mace under one of those rafters, what happens to the second floor, right? So that's what our first part of the Mishnah is ve'hein mechuvanos. So now that it says ve'hein mechuvanos, that the rafters on the first floor and the rafters on the second floor are perfectly aligned when it comes to the height. So it says the Gemara, Tuma tachas achas mehen tachteha tame. If on the first floor, under one of the beams on the first floor, there's tuma, it doesn't go up any further because it has an ohel above it. So therefore, the second floor is safe. However, bein hatachtona le'elyona, if it's between the first floor and the second floor, then beinehen tame, and al gabe ha'elyona, and if it's on top of the first floor, at the floor of the second floor, then kinegda ad l'rakia tame, that's going to be its own problem. So then, therefore, we see that if the wood is aligned on the first floor and the second floor, so that because let's say that I'm on my third beam on the house, so 1, 2, 3, I'm on my third beam of the roof of my first floor, okay, and that's the first floor. And on the second floor is the beam, the same exact beam, one right above the other. So if there's tuma here, this ohel stops the tuma, and everything up there is fine. If it's in between the 2 posts, so then the tuma is ola ad l'rakia because there's nothing to stop it. There's no ohel. If it's above the first floor, so now the tuma is here on top of the first beam, then it's only going to stop at the second beam on the second floor because they're mechuvanos. These beams are all together. But now the Mishnah pivots direction here and says, what if they're not aligned? And the Mishnah says, hayu ha'elyonos kebein hatachtonos. What if the upper rafters were in their up-down landscape were in between the lower rafters? So these are my lower rafters, right? And then on the next floor, it's they're staggered. It's like the way you make bricks, right? So they're staggered. So right above, immediately above the first floor rafter is nothing. It's just sky, right? Because there's the second floor doesn't align. So you have, let's say, for the bottom floor, you have every 16 inches, you have a piece of wood, and it starts at 0, 16 inches, and 32. But on the second floor, it starts at 8 inches, 24 inches, right? It's staggered. So now the beams don't align. That's this case of hayu ha'elyonos kebena tachtonos. If you have the upper rafters in between the lower rafters, so then tuma tachtehen tachas kulan tame. That means that if on the bottom floor you have tuma, then the entire house is going to be tamei. This is an example of chavut rami, because here's what's happening. Really, if you look at a snapshot of just the high, just in one cut, you'll see the lower one is right here at 16 inches, and this one's at 24 inches, and we just said the whole thing is tamei. That's because of chavut rami. Halachically speaking, that's what this Mishnah is implying very strongly here. That tachtei, is that right? Tachtei and tachas kulan tamei. Al gabehen, had it been that the tuma was on top of one of the rafters, well, there's nothing above it. So kenegda ad l'rakia tame. Everything is going to be tame in that case, straight above it. So airplane, whatever the case is, you fly above it, you're in a parachute, you're tame mace, right? Whatever the tuma is, it's ola ad l'rakia, because if it's sitting on the rafter of the first floor and the rafters of the second floor are specifically misaligned, then the tuma goes straight up. There's no ohel to stop it. So this is a Mishnah that speaks about the idea that that chavud rami, that we know that the upper rafters can be lowered, and we also know that it's only one tefach. And that's where Rava came up with his idea. So let's finish the Gemara's argument here. The Tani Allah, and we have a brisa on this Mishnah that reads as follows. Bamed dvarim amurim bisman sheyesh ben tefach ubenein poseach tefach. That's when you have a tefach and it has a space to fall into. That's also a tefach. Aval ein benehen tefach poseach tefach. If there isn't a tefach between them, so then it's not, the tumah is not going to stay there. Tumah tachas achas mehen tachtel tameh. Then the chavod rami doesn't work. If the chavod is not a tefach, then it doesn't work. Then the tumah that's under the lower one will only affect the lower one and not the. There's no chavod rami when it's less than a tefach. So then the Gemara says its point. Beinehen al gabehen tahor. Then if it's in between them, then it's going to be totally tahor if the wood is less than a tefach on the second floor. Alma. And this is the point of all of this very long Mishnah with its two parts. Alma, 10 lines from the bottom. Ki isbe tefach amrinan chavud rami. When the boards that we're discussing have a tefach in width, that's when we say chavud rami, that they halachically drop down to be level with the rest of the schach. V'chi lesbe tefach, and when they are thinner than that, lo amrin and chavud rami shma mina. This supports the idea of Rava. Let's go back to where we started so that we have some clarity. There is a machlokes that says when we have Shmuel's case in the Mishnah of schach that's separated from one another, they're alternating in their height. So the first shita was of the opinion that they have to be within 3 tefachim. Shmuel's and Rava says no, they could even be more than 3 tefachim. How? Chavud rami. As long as it's a tefach, it could be chavud rami. But the Gemara questions all of this. We're 8-9 lines from the bottom. Yossi Rav Kahana v'Kamar lahashmaisa. Rav Kahana was sitting and talking and learning, and he quoted this shita of Rava. Rashi here says specifically, he was talking about the din of Rava, that chavud rami applies specifically when the wood that's in discussion is at least a tefach wide. But the Gemara says, I can bring you a raya brura that that's not correct. Amar le Ravashi le Rav Kahana. Ravashi says to Rav Kahana, V'chol heicha delesbe tefach lo amrinan chavud rami. The wood has to be a tefach. I can show you a case where it will not be a tefach and it'll still be chavud rami. What is that case scenario? So it says the Gemara as follows. Tanya, 5 lines from the bottom. Now we're going to go back to the world of Eruvin. We learned this many blot ago. You have a koreh, a beam. You're trying to be machshir walking in a mavui. So you take a piece of wood and you extended it. Let's say these are your doorways, and you've taken a piece of wood. This pen could be the piece of wood. It doesn't quite reach the other side. This would be the matir. This wood would be the koreh. It would be the matir. So says the Gemara, if the koreh is yotze mikosel zeh, ain't no gas bekosel zeh, it doesn't quite reach. And similarly, a case where you have shtei koros, you have 2 boards, one coming out of the right side, one coming out of the left side, and they don't quite reach, and they don't quite reach each other. In both of these cases, the halacha is the same. Pachos mishlosha, if the gap between the 2 pieces of wood extending from the opening of the mavui are within 3 tefachim, so then eina tzarich lahavi korah acheres, and we don't need any more wood. The halacha is it's lavud, and lavud basically connects everything, and you're good to go. Shlosha, but if the gap between the one piece of wood and the other side of the wall, or the 2 pieces of wood that are not quite meeting in the middle, if that gap is 3 or more, then tzarech lahavi korah acheres. That's part 1 of the Mishnah, not really relevant to our argument. We'll get to our argument soon enough. What's very interesting over here is something that we did learn about in Maseches Eruvin, is that we are so familiar with speaking about lavud in terms of it being only 3 tefachim. However, there is a sheet in the Tanaim that lavud is 4 tefachim. We saw this in Maseches Eruvin and Maseches Shabbos. Repeated here, the very last few words on Chaf Beis Amud Aleph, Reb Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, that it's not 3, but rather pachos me arba ein tzarech lahavi korah acheres, but arba tzarech lahavi korah acheres. He holds that lavud has a din of 4 tefachim and not 3. That would literally undo like probably 5 pages of this Masechta, most of Maseches Eruvin, and a quarter of Maseches Shabbos. Lavud is all over Shas. And this is a fundamental machlokes, and we seem to almost blanketly ignore the sheet of Reb Shimon ben Gamliel. No one speaks about it in halachic terms. Like whenever you look in the Shulchan Aruch, nobody really talks about it. By and large, we only look at this shita. Let's continue this brisa because we have yet to get to our question. V'chein, similarly, 3 lines down, Chaf Beis Amud Beis. Shtei koros hamas imos. You have 2 matching pieces of wood. Lo bezukadei lakabel ariach. Not any one of them is strong enough to hold a brick. Velo bezukadei lakabel ariach. They're very thin boards, right? They're very thin. So im mekablos ariach L'rochbo tefach. If its width when the two of them are together is a tefach and then it can hold a brick, so then ein tzarich lahavi korah acheres, then that's considered to be sufficient. These two pieces of wood are able to hold. They're a tefach wide together. V'im lav, if that's not the case, then tzarich lahavi korah acheres. What does Reb Shimon ben Gamliel omer? Reb Shimon ben Gamliel says instead of putting them to the width of those pieces of wood, Rashbag Omer imekavlos ariach leorko shlosha tfachim, that it's able to take a brick that's 3 tfachim going lengthwise. So then ein tzarich lahavi korah acheres v'im lav tzarich lahavi korah acheres. So that's a machlokes on how to test these two thinner pieces of wood. Okay, now here's where we come in with chavet rami. All of this was just the precursor. Hayu achas lemala ve'achas lemata. Now we already can see the relevance of chavet rami. You have one piece of wood that's a little bit higher and one piece of wood that's a little bit lower. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, roin ha'elyona ki'ilu hi lemata, ve'esa tachtona ki'ilu hi lemala, ubilvad shelo tehei ha'elyona lemala me'esrim ama, ve'atachtona lemata me'asara. We see that these two pieces of wood, neither of which are a tefach wide. Only together are they a tefach wide. But when they're far apart from one another, even to the height of 19 amos and down to 10 tfachim, we treat them as though they're level. But that's a big problem because Rava was of the opinion that chavet rami, that leveling them out only works when there's a tefach. But this case was only that they're a tefach when they're together. And now they're separated and you're saying chavet rami. That's a kasha on Rava because Rava said that chavet rami requires a tefach. This case clearly says that chavet rami does not require a tefach. Let's see the Gemara's articulation of the question. And the Gemara says, Hazeh v'zeh b'soch esrim, both of them are within the height of the sukkah. Amrinan chavut rami. We do say that we bring the two of them in height together. Amrinan chavut rami. Afal gav de lespe tefach. Even though the wood themselves, each piece of wood is not a tefach, kasha and Rava. So how could Rava say tefach? It doesn't seem to be the case. It doesn't seem to matter. So says the Gemara as follows: a third of the way down, kaf beis amud beis.
So what's Rava's din of tefach?
Rava says that when we say chavet rami, that a board above is treated halachically, that it's as if it's at the level of the sukkah, it has to be at least a tefach wide. But this brisa, which is before him, it's tonight. This brisa says not like him. This brisa shows that half and half. Exactly. Well, that would be a svara for an answer, is to combine the two. But that's not what the Gemara said. The Gemara says, maybe we can say as follows. Ubilvad shelo tehei elyona lemala me'esrim ela b'soch esrim ve'atachtona smucha la b'pachos mishlosha. Maybe here we use lavud. And this is kind of what you're hinting to, is that if there is lavud between the two, that the two boards are within lavud, even though Rava doesn't care about lavud in general when it comes to chavet rami. We saw that on the previous page. Because that was, we said, the schach has to be within 3. Rava says, no, we don't. Even within 5, 10, 15, no problem, chavet rami, because it's a tefach. But when it's not a tefach, then we need lavud. That's how Rava would explain this case, and that's answer number 1. Inami, another answer, this just the reverse in its heights. Inami bilvad shalote tachtona lamata me'asar. The lower one can't be under the 10 tefach mark. Same answer again, just focusing on the height of the sukkah versus on the highest point of the sukkah or the lowest point of the sukkah. But once we have a gap of at least 3 between the two pieces of wood, and now we have kaftar v'ferach, we have a very clear understanding of Rava, which is that when we are talking about chavet rami, the din that a plank can be halachically lowered, not physically lowered, that's only true under 2 circumstances. Either the board is a tefach, but it can even be more than 3 tefachim high apart, because chavet rami applies even above 3 tefachim. Or if they're thinner, they're only, let's say, half of a tefach each, then they need to be lavud. And then we say chavet rami, even if it's less than a tefach, then it all works out. Beautiful. That brings us to the 2 dots. We are 2/3 of the way down, Chav Beis, Amud Beis. We're going to go until just about halfway down on the page of Chav Gimel Amud Aleph. Let's continue. Says the Gemara, we said in our Mishnah that if you have a sukkah where the shade is greater than the sun, the halacha is that it's kshera. What's the implication of that? Is that as long as it's 51% shade, you're good to go. But ki hadade, what if it's 50-50? Literally 50-50. You measured. You have a sukkah that's 6 amos wide. It's exactly 3 and 3 shade and light at the height of the sukkah. What do? So then the Gemara says it seems to imply ha'kiadade psula, but that doesn't work because v'hatnan be'idach pirkin. We learned in another parak the opposite phrase. Our Mishnah says sil samrubim mechamsa. What did it say earlier in the Masechta? V'shacham samrubim misilsa. But when there's more sun, we said psula. What does that imply? Hakiyadadik shera. It implies 50-50 would work. Opposite implications. And then the Gemara, this is where a little bit of abstract thinking comes into play, says the Gemara, lo kasha, this is not a difficulty. These two quotes in the Mishnayos can be worked out beautifully. Kan milemala, kan milemata. What is this talking about? Take a look at Rashi. Rashi is just to our left, a few lines down. Dibur hamaschel kan milemala, kan milemata. Says the Gemara, hadadai kinan ki hadade psula. When we inferred from our Mishnah, which says that Zilsa Meruba Mechamsa is Kshera, and we implied that if it's therefore 50-50, it should be Psula. So that's Limala, that's up there by the top of the Sukkah. If at the top of the Sukkah, it is exactly 50-50, so then the light at the ground is going to be greater than 50-50. Because when light comes in, it's mispashaded, it widens. Kind of like a flashlight. If you have a ray of light, it will widen in front of you. So if you have, let's say, a one tefach opening in your sukkah and the sun's coming down, it will be much wider than one tefach on the ground. So that's what the Gemara says. It's not a stira. At the top of the sukkah, if it's exactly 50-50, so that's a big problem. But if at the bottom of the sukkah it's 50-50, what does that tell you about the schach? Much tighter, much tighter. What is not discussed here? If the schach is between those two measurements. That's not discussed in the Gemara. We need Rishonim for that, which is to say, what if it's 55% at the top, but 35% on the ground? That's not discussed here. We're discussing only two extremes. The schach is exactly 50-50 and therefore puzzle, because on the ground it's 80%, right? Or 100%. The light can overlap from each, could be a lot. And the other case that's discussed is when the ground is 50-50. But in between those two, we don't have any dialogue in the Gemara so far. We don't know the answer to that question. But that was a question that you were asking. What?
What would be the question?
The question would be let's say on the top is 51%. We didn't discuss that. It's still some Reuben Mechamsa, but on the ground you still have
75%.
yeah. So it's not discussed. It's implied from the Gemara that it's mutter, but the rationale that the Gemara is giving halamal and halamata implies that we really care in measurement about what's on the ground.
Right.
But that's not the pshat in the Gemara. The Gemara doesn't do that. The Gemara just says if it's 51% of shade, you're good. But that doesn't make sense, because the difference between 51% shade at the top level and 50% at the top level is negligible at the bottom. There's way more light than shade on the ground. So that's not discussed here in the
Is there
Gemara.
anything that's discussed about, like, at different times?
Of the day,
Yeah, because at 8
Oh.
o'clock in the morning,
yeah, the sun's
That's
never
what
peering
they
in.
go.
The sun's never peering in at 8 o'clock in the
Right.
morning. But that's not relevant. This is a theoretical conversation, because even if it's cloudy, you still have a mitzvah in Sukkah, right? It's not that we need the sun to peer. What?
But I didn't have the answer what the
No,
sun
yeah,
is.
okay, you need the answer to the question, but it doesn't mean that you can't be Yotzei Sukkah if it's cloudy out or if the sun is below the height of your Sukkah. You're still Yotzei. We need it to be theoretically possible that sun could peer through your schach. We'll see that a little bit more in a minute, but that is what the Gemara is talking about here. We don't care where the sun is. You can be Yotzei even if the sun is below the height of your Sukkah, not shining in at all. It's cloudy, doesn't make a difference. The first night of Sukkah, it's dark out. And we have fulfilled the mitzvah deraisa, tesvav. Some people eat matzah in the Sukkah, all the shtiklach. So that's, I don't know if it's shtik. It might be really halachic. I'm just saying. I don't know what it is. I don't know. Can I delete the last 10 seconds? So says the Gemara, and they actually have a catchphrase like this. Amar Rav Papa, Hainu da'amri inchi kizuza mila'el, like the coin of a zuz at the top, ki istara milatachas. It widens out to a larger coin at the bottom, just indicating, of course, that light spreads. Let's keep going. Tanu Rabban Hamauva kimin bias. We said that if the roof is thick like that of a house, so Tanu Rabbanan Hamauva kimin bias. There's a brisa that aligns with our Mishnah. That if in fact the schach is thick like it would be in a house, even though when you're in the sukkah you can't see any stars, so kshera. So says the Gemara. What about ein kochvei chama nirin mitocha? What about the rays of the sun? Much brighter. You really did a good job on your schach. You didn't put up 2 bamboo sheets. You put up 20 bamboo sheets and no light can get in. It's perfectly dark. So says the Gemara, that's a machlokas beis Shammai, beis Hillel. Beis Shammai postlin, uveis Hillel machshirin. Okay, there's a lumdus behind that as well. Let's continue. The new Mishnah opens 6-7 lines from the bottom, chaf beis and beis, a little bit more to go. Ha'osa sukaso berosh ha'agala. If a person were to make a sukkah berosh ha'agala on the top of a cart, o berosh ha'sfina, or on a boat, kshera, that's mutter. Ve olin la beyom tov. What a strange language. What do you mean by olin la beyom tov? Of course you're olin beyom tov.
To the sukkah or to the boat?
To the sukkah. So the Gemara assumes you're already on the boat. or one of that, because right, that may be its own problem. We assume that there's two things at play here. One is the following: is the sukkah halachically kosher? Question mark. And number two is, can I access it on Shabbos and Yontif? So yes, in the ratio of our Mishnah, when it comes to an agala, when it comes to a sfina, not only is the sukkah kosher, but it's mutter to access. What's the contrast point? Things which are not mutter to access. Says the Mishnah, Birosha Ilan, what if you build it in a givaldic tree house and you removed all of the branches from above you so that you don't have any schach mechubar? It's a perfect sukkah, but it's climbing a tree, which you're not allowed to do. So Barosha Ilan al Gabe Gamal, or to ride an animal, which is also not allowed on Shabbos because we're afraid that you may break off a stick. I think that's a Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, that you break off the stick and you might hit the animal. So we don't ride animals. So the halacha is kshera, the sukkah is kosher, but it's only good for Chol HaMoed. The Ein Olam La B'Yom Tov, you're just not allowed to access it. It's Nisr D'Rabbanan. We have a lot of Yisurei D'Rabbanan that undo Dinei D'Oraisa, like shofar on Shabbos by Rosh Hashanah. A lot of halachos like that. So here too, if you built your sukkah in a place that has an Nisr D'Rabbanan to access, so you're done for it. You can't use that. You can't fulfill the mitzvah on Yontif itself, only during Chol HaMoed. The Mishnah continues, what if two of the walls, Shtayim Be'ilan, two of the walls are made of tree, Achas Bidei Adam, and one wall is made by man, O Shtayim Bidei Adam, or maybe even two walls are made by man, Achas Be'ilan Kshera, and one of them is made by a tree. Still, the halacha is a sukkah's kosher, but still, Ve'ein Olam La B'Yom Tov. We first need three. Until all three halachic walls are built by man and rooted on the ground, done. You cannot climb that tree. You have to find a way to use the sukkah without the tree being a part of it, because you can't climb a tree. Shalosh bidei adam. What if you have three halachic walls that were made by man and they're connected to the ground? You're able to enter the sukkah from there without climbing the tree. Va'achas be'ilan. And the fourth wall, which we now know is an extraneous wall because of how we paskin in halacha of only two walls and a tefach. So then that's kshera ve'olim la b'yom tov. Zeh hakbal. Turning to the top of Chav Gimel Amud Aleph. Kol shenital ha'ilan. The halacha is that the way we need to look at trees, the way we need to look at sukkahs, that have trees as part of their construction, is that if the tree were to be removed, would it still be standing? So that's why the Mishnah said we need three walls that are man-made without that last wall. If you remove the tree, then we've circumvented all of the problems.
Why would you need three over there when every place else you just need two and a tefach?
That third wall can be a tefach. That's what three means. Okay. Three means two and a tefach. Yeah. Mani Masnisin, 3 lines down, Chav Gimel Amud Aleph. Who's the author of our Mishnah? It must be Rabbi Akiva. What did Rabbi Akiva say? We're going to see in a moment, but which din of our Mishnah we're talking about? You'll see we're talking about the boat. What did it say in the beginning of our Mishnah? He said that if you build a sukkah on a boat, not only is the sukkah kosher, but you can go in it on Yontif. Story time. Rabbi Akiva, he Tanya, the Brisa writes, that if you make a sukkah on top of a boat, Rabban Gamliel posel, Rabbi Akiva machshir. That's how Rabbi Akiva's our Mishnah. He says that you're allowed to build it in our Mishnah. He says that that's mutter, and you can be ola even on Yom Tov. Maisa, the story goes, but Rabban Gamliel, Rabbi Akiva, shayiboim besfina. They were traveling by boat. They didn't get back in time. They had to build a sukkah where they were. So they had prepared. They had, their pop-up sukkah, and they were throwing some schach up on top of the boat. Amar Rabbi Akiva va'asa sukkah b'rosh hasfina. Because that's how he paskins. He paskins that it's mutter to build a sukkah on a boat, and you can even be ola b'yom tov, no problem. Lemachar, the next day, nashba ruach ve'akarta. A gust of wind came by and says bye-bye to the sukkah, blows it overboard, and the whole sukkah is gone. Omar lo Rabban Gamliel, a little tongue-in-cheek, Akiva, heichan sukkascha. Where'd your sukkah go? Where'd your sukkah go? Now, this wasn't just a banter. This was his position. He held that doesn't work. And this was a little siyata dishmaya. And he says, the Kodesh Baruch Hu told you, Rabbi Akiva, that your sukkah is a zero. You know how I know? Because he tossed it overboard. Goodbye. Your sukkah is not kosher. So that was this little rhetorical line of Rabban Gamliel, because as we saw right at the open of this Gemara in the Brisa, said that Rabban Gamliel is posel. You're not allowed to build a sukkah on a sfina. So says the Gemara, Amar Abai, just 1 second. Abai and Amora coming far after this conversation, but Abai is qualifying the discussion. De kule alma, everyone agrees. Heicha de'ena yechola la'amod beruach mitzuya de'abasha, that if a sukkah is not able to withstand a ruach mitzuya, a regular type of wind, whatever it is, 20 miles an hour, whatever is considered a regular speed for a wind, if it cannot handle that de'abasha on dry land, lo klumhi, that's not considered a sukkah. Okay, yechola la'amod b'she'ena mitzuya de'abasha, if it's able to withstand a very strong wind on dry land, kol yamol pligidik sheir. That's pasha. We're obviously talking about an in-between category, because that was Rabban Gamliel's whole concern, is that the sukkah is not kavua enough. Ki pligi. Where is the machlokes in the opening of our Gemara, where the Bryce is quoted between Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Akiva, Ki pligi b'diyachola la'amod beruach mitzuyah de'abasha, where yes, the case is where the sukkah that's being built is able to withstand a normal wind on dry land, ve'ena yachola la'amod beruach she'ena mitzuyah de'abasha, and it's not able to handle that strong wind on the ground. So it's kind of like an in-between category. Rabban Gamliel savar sukkah diras keva ba'inan. Rabban Gamliel is of the opinion that a sukkah needs to have a certain kviyas. The keva de'ena yochol alama beruach mitzuyah deyam, and because it's not able to tolerate the wind of the aruach mitzuya of the water, so lo klumhi, because on location where you are right now, that just doesn't work. That same wind on the ground, okay, that's ruach she'ena mitzuya, but you're on the water now. So do we say that the standard of strength of the sukkah is relative to yabasha objectively, even if you're over there in the water, or do we say that no, when you're in the water, you gotta build it the right way for the water? So that's a machlokes, and therefore lo klumhi. Rabbi Akiva savar, Rabbi Akiva is of the opinion sukkah diras harai ba'inan. Sukkah is just a diras harai. We don't need it to be a heavy kviyas. The kaven the yechol alama beruch mitzuya de'abasha kshera. And since it is able to withstand that ruch mitzuya on the ground, we don't need more of a kviyas than that. Therefore, kshera, the sukkah would be kosher. We'll stop right here, halfway down Chav Gimel Amud Aleph. We'll pick up on Shabbos 1 hour before Mincha. We'll learn Chav Gimel, the rest of Chav Gimel Amud Aleph, Chav Gimel Amud Beis, and Chav Dalet. Wishing you all a beautiful night.